In the early chronicles of American history, the voices and contributions of women are strikingly absent. Traditional narratives have long been dominated by figures of power, male explorers, generals, and statesmen, whose deeds are etched into the annals of the nation's founding. This absence is not incidental. It reflects a broader societal structure where women were relegated to the background, their labor and influence undervalued or outright ignored. Even as women formed the backbone of communities, managing households, nurturing families, and contributing essential labor to the survival of early settlements, their names and stories faded into obscurity. Historical records often omitted their struggles and achievements, treating them as footnotes to the deeds of men. The result was a skewed historical memory that elevated the public acts of a few while erasing the intimate, yet no less significant, contributions of many. Howard Zinn draws attention to this structural invisibility, comparing it to the systemic exclusion of other marginalized groups. He notes that women, like enslaved people, were essential to the functioning of society, yet their roles were framed as natural duties rather than contributions worthy of acknowledgement. In doing so, the dominant historical narratives effectively sanctioned their subjugation, perpetuating myths of male superiority and female dependence. This erasure extended beyond the domestic sphere. Even in moments of national upheaval, such as the American Revolution or westward expansion, when women's labor and sacrifices were critical, they remained invisible in the official accounts. Women acted as organizers, caregivers, and sometimes as combatants, yet their presence was systematically diminished. Their exclusion from historical narratives did not merely reflect the prejudices of the time. It actively reinforced them, ensuring that future generations would inherit a skewed understanding of the past. The roots of women's oppression, Howard Zinn argues, are intertwined with biology and the evolution of property-based societies. The biological reality of childbearing, a vital function for the survival of any community, was transformed into a tool of control. In early societies built on competition and private property, this role became a basis for subordinating women. The family unit, structured around monogamy, was established as a means to manage labor and inheritance. Women were positioned as reproducers and caretakers, their contributions confined to the domestic sphere while men dominated public and economic life. This control was not merely a natural byproduct of survival, but a deliberate framework to sustain the power of male-dominated hierarchies. Property, both material and familial, became central to this dynamic. The regulation of women's sexuality ensured clear lines of inheritance, fortifying systems of wealth and power that depended on patrilineal descent. Women, therefore, were not only essential to the household economy, but also to the consolidation of patriarchal power. Religious and cultural systems further institutionalized these roles. In many societies, doctrines framed women's subservience as divinely ordained, reinforcing the belief that their primary purpose lay in serving their families and husbands. This ideological underpinning not only justified but normalized their exclusion from broader social and political participation. The resulting oppression was intimate, persistent, and pervasive. Women's labor and their very identities were tied to their reproductive roles, reducing their autonomy and rendering them economically dependent. This dependency, in turn, was leveraged to maintain control, ensuring that the structures of wealth and power remained unchallenged. Zinn emphasizes that this system was not universal but emerged in tandem with the development of competitive, property-focused societies. In contrast, many indigenous and communal cultures valued women's roles in ways that defied the rigid confines of patriarchal norms. Yet, in the societies that shaped the dominant historical narrative, biology and property became the twin pillars of systemic inequality, embedding women's oppression into the very fabric of civilization. In stark contrast to the rigid gender hierarchies that came to dominate European and colonial societies, many pre-colonial cultures exhibited striking degrees of gender equality. Among indigenous communities in the Americas, for example, women often held roles that went far beyond the domestic sphere, challenging the later narratives of universal patriarchy. In the Zuni communities, Women's authority extended to property ownership and agricultural management, placing them at the center of economic life. Similarly, among the Iroquois Confederacy, women were integral to governance, selecting and advising male leaders in their matrilineal society. These roles were not seen as exceptional, but as natural extensions of their contributions to the collective well-being. Here, balance rather than hierarchy defined gender relations. Such societies operated within frameworks that valued communal responsibility over individual gain. Without the constraints of private property and inheritance systems, gender roles were often fluid and complementary, rather than restrictive and oppositional. This dynamic allowed for the recognition of women's contributions in spheres that were essential to survival and prosperity, from food production to spiritual practices. However, the arrival of European settlers disrupted these systems. European colonizers imposed patriarchal structures that marginalized women's roles, aligning indigenous gender relations with the colonizers' own hierarchical models. Over time, this shift eroded much of the balance that had characterized these societies. Zinn's analysis underscores that gender relations are not immutable, but are deeply shaped by social and economic systems. The relative equality in pre-colonial societies stands as a testament to the diverse ways in which human communities have organized themselves and serves as a reminder that the rigid gender roles imposed by European colonization were neither universal nor inevitable. Women's resistance to their prescribed roles within patriarchal societies was persistent, even in the face of overwhelming social and cultural norms designed to suppress dissent. In Puritan New England, where gender hierarchies were rigidly enforced through religious doctrine, women found ways to assert their voices and challenge the structures that confined them. The household, often idealized as a sanctuary of order and piety, became a contested space where acts of rebellion and defiance quietly unfolded. Zinn highlights how women resisted through actions both subtle and overt. They petitioned for divorces in cases of cruelty or neglect, directly challenging the patriarchal ideals of marriage. Women also organized themselves in community networks, leveraging their shared labor and social ties to assert influence in matters often deemed beyond their purview. These acts, though constrained by the era's norms, reflected a refusal to fully submit to a system that saw them as subordinate. In addition, cultural norms themselves became a battleground. The ideals of purity and piety imposed on women were subverted through actions that broke with traditional expectations. Women who openly discussed grievances, defied community leaders, or rejected imposed roles through acts of non-compliance demonstrated an enduring capacity to push against the confines of their societal roles. This resistance was not limited to individual acts. Over time, it coalesced into broader movements. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, women were increasingly active in reform movements, using their perceived roles as moral guardians to challenge issues such as slavery, alcohol abuse, and labor exploitation. These efforts laid the groundwork for organized feminist activism, showing how women could both navigate and challenge cultural norms to assert their agency within an oppressive framework. In Zinn's view, these acts of resistance, whether quiet acts of defiance or early organizing efforts, exemplify the resilience of women in asserting their humanity. Their struggles reveal the cracks within a system that sought to limit them, serving as a precursor to more explicit demands for equality in the centuries to come. As societal conditions evolved, so too did the frameworks of women's oppression and resistance. The rise of industrial capitalism brought significant shifts, both in how gender roles were structured and in how they were contested. Women, previously confined largely to the domestic sphere, were increasingly drawn into the workforce, particularly in textile mills and factories. These spaces of labor introduced new challenges, as women faced harsh conditions, low wages, and exploitative practices, but they also provided avenues for collective organization and public visibility. The industrial age also catalyzed broader social movements, many of which intersected with women's struggles for equality. The abolitionist movement in the United States, for example, became a platform through which women could voice their own demands for justice. Figures such as Sojourner Truth and Angelina Grimke demonstrated how women could leverage the rhetoric of human rights to challenge not only slavery, but also the systemic inequality of gender. Zinn underscores the role of the family in these shifting dynamics. While industrialization altered traditional family structures, it also reinforced the idea of the home as a moral refuge, with women as its custodians. This dual role, as both exploited laborers in the public sphere and moral anchors in the private one, intensified the pressures on women while providing a basis for emerging feminist critiques. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the birth of organized feminist movements, spurred by these changing conditions. The push for suffrage, labor rights, and educational access was not merely a reaction to oppression, but also a reflection of women's growing awareness of their collective power. The family, long a site of patriarchal control, began to transform into a site of resistance, where women challenged norms and redefined their roles. By situating women's movements within these larger economic and social changes, Zinn highlights the interplay between systemic forces and individual agency. These movements were not isolated phenomena, but part of a broader struggle to reimagine society itself, with women demanding a voice in shaping its future. The changing conditions of the modern era did not merely alter the landscape of oppression. They provided the tools and opportunities for women to mount their most concerted challenges yet. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to The Knowledge.